When we left Paul and Silas the last time, we had just finished working in the city of Athens in Greece. And from there, the story continues. Chapter 18. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. Here again is one of the places where we can put a firm date to the events that are occurring in the story, because we know that in AD 53, Claudius, who was the emperor of the Roman Empire from AD 41 to AD 54, ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. It's recorded in a guy named Suetonius, and the expulsion order was given, Suetonius says, because of, quote, their continual tumults instigated by Chrestus. Chrestus, obviously a misspelling of the name Christ or Christus. So we know that there was such an uproar about what was going on in the church that even the Roman Empire took note. Continues on in verse 2. Paul went to see them, that is Aquila and Priscilla. And because he was a tent maker, as they were, he stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Verse 5. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. So, picture this. Paul goes ahead while Silas and Timothy are there to finish up the work in Berea because of the divisive character that Paul had become. Meanwhile, we see Paul busying himself with a rather ordinary living, making himself useful with his new friends Priscilla and Aquila. And then only after his cohorts arrive from Berea can he stop working with his hands and focus solely on preaching. I've always found this interesting because it makes Paul and all the characters in the story so much more believable and so much more human. I think sometimes when you just read straight through something like the Acts of the Apostles, you get the impression that Paul is on the road to Damascus and he sees the blinding light and he sees Jesus, and then bam, he immediately goes out and starts preaching around the world. But the story tells us a much more human story of Paul, where he spends years putting things together and re-examining the scriptures, and only after more than a decade does he go out into the world as a missionary sent out by the church in Antioch. Here we see that he wasn't going from one camp meeting to another, but that he was actually taking time to earn a living for himself as a rather ordinary tent maker. Verse 6. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said to them, your blood be on your own hands. I'm innocent of it. From now on I will go to the Gentiles. Paul, again, continuing the pattern of going to his brother Jews first, and when they refuse, when they stop listening, to the Gentiles. People reject the gospel sometimes. That brings up an interesting question for our discussion. Verse 7. Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titius Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and his entire household believed in the Lord, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. Pause there for a second. Titius Justus, a Roman name, and therefore a Gentile name. So Paul leaves the synagogue after telling them he's done with the Jews, he's going to go to the Gentiles. He goes right next door to a Gentile worshiper of God. Now, in the city of Corinth, surely we've all heard about some of the stories about what Corinth was like. The immorality in the city was renowned, even in antiquity, when many cities were immoral. It was often associated with the cult of Aphrodite. In fact, the first century historian Strabo claims that the temple, the Aphrodite's temple in Corinth, boasted over 1,000 prostitutes, men and women. There was a proverb that said, "Not for every man is the voyage to Corinth," simply because it was a very expensive place too, very cosmopolitan, and they considered themselves worldly, let's say, Epicureans of philosophy, and they had a population of about 80,000 to 100,000. It was a Roman colony, and it was the seat of the Roman government for the entire province of Asia. It was a metropolitan city, and they thought of themselves as very sophisticated. Verse 9. One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. "Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city." And so Paul stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, teaching them the Word of God. I want you to notice the present tense of what's happening here. Jesus appears to him and tells him not to be afraid. He says, "I am with you." Many people are in this city. The Spirit of Jesus, alive and active and working through the messengers that he has sent into the world, including Paul. An interesting time for Paul to get encouragement in the middle of a very discouraging situation. Verse 12. While Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews of Corinth made a united attack on Paul and brought him into the place of judgment. "This man," they charged, "is persuading people to worship God in ways contrary to the law." Now, to put a little flesh on those bones, the Jews were claiming that Paul was advocating a religion that was not recognized or sanctioned by Roman authorities, as the Jewish religion was. It wasn't that the Romans respected it, but they were a very synchronistic empire and allowed the people of the lands they conquered to continue being the same people they were before, only with a Roman overlord and a Roman flavor. So Judaism was an authorized religion. These Jews were claiming to the Roman authorities that this new religion Paul was speaking of was not sanctioned by Rome, which, had Paul had an opportunity to speak, he could have proved how the Christian religion was the culmination of the Jewish religion, but he doesn't get to speak. Verse 14. Just as Paul was about to speak, Gallio said to them, "If you Jews are making a complaint about some misdemeanor or serious crime, it will be reasonable for me to listen to you. But since it involves questions about words and names in your own law, settle the matter yourselves. I will not be a judge of such things." So he drove them off. Then the crowd there turned on Sosthenes, the synagogue leader, and beat him in front of the proconsul. And Gallio showed no concern whatever. Now we're going to meet a few interesting characters that I think it's important for us to spend a little time with, particularly not as you read only Acts, but as you read the rest of the New Testament. Verse 18. Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time, a year and a half in this case. And then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae of a vow he had taken. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. I know that was one of Corinth's 2 seaports. The vow that he had taken, referring to Paul, was a typical ending of a vow. When you make a vow because of protection that you've asked for or something like that, at the end of the vow you were to cut off your hair, and that's probably what's going on there. So they arrive at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila, and he himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. So his new friends, Aquila and Priscilla, we'll hear about more of them. Paul leaves them, and as his pattern is, speaks to the Jews first. Now, in Ephesus, it's a leading commercial center in all of Asia Minor. It was the capital of the province of Asia, and it was also the keeper of the temple of Artemis, or Diana. Verse 20. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. That is, the Jews at the synagogue in Ephesus. But as he left, he promised, I will come back if it is God's will. And then he set sail from Ephesus. And when he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch. So, thus, we have the ending of the second missionary journey. The circle is complete, and Paul has returned to Antioch, presumably to give a report to the church there about all that has happened. Now, back up for a second. Aquila and Priscilla. Paul had stayed with Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth, as it says, and they go with them as far as Ephesus. There, they stay. Paul moves on. As you read other parts of the New Testament, you pick up more details about Aquila and Priscilla. Apparently, there was a church that met in their house. 1 Corinthians 16 lists them as one of the ones that Paul will greet. And even later, in the last chapter of the letter to the Romans, Paul again greets the church in their house. We find out from a third letter, from 2 Timothy chapter 4:19, that they were also again in Ephesus at some point later. So, to finish up this chapter, verse 23 says, after spending some time in Antioch, Paul set out from there and traveled from place to place throughout the region of Galatia and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Now, that may not be a missionary journey per se, but it certainly is a journey. Even though he's not establishing new churches, he's strengthening old churches as well. Now, here's another character that I want us to learn more about. Again, not only for the Acts of the Apostles letter, but also for all the New Testament letters. Verse 24 says, meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the Scriptures. This is quite a lengthy description of this character. Verse 25, he had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more accurately. Now, this 4-verse description of Apollos is very telling. As a, quote, learned man, he would have been privately educated to a university level of education with the much prized Greek rhetorical education. And these kinds of educational experiences were very expensive and opened only to the elite of his time. And when Luke says he was, quote, powerful in his use of scriptures, the word powerful there is a rhetorical term used for describing a logical and forceful delivery. He had been taught in the ways of the Lord, presumably by disciples of John the Baptist, whose preaching, John's, was always couched in terms of preparing the way for Jesus. Interesting to note that John the Baptist's message had spread well beyond Judea into the areas of Egypt and Asia Minor at this point. So initially, Apollos preaches in the Ephesian synagogue, and when Priscilla and Aquila heard him speaking, they invite him to their house, probably to speak. We know from Romans 16 that they had a house church. And even though Apollos taught about Jesus accurately, they filled in some of the gaps in his knowledge. Like any other disciple of John who was not part of the apostolic band, he would presumably not have known about Jesus' death and his resurrection and the kingdom that he had established. And so Apollos is taken under the wing of Aquila and Priscilla. And after he is more fully taught the way of the Lord and understands how to preach Jesus, he expresses a desire to go towards Corinth, that is in Achaia. and the Ephesian church apparently encourages him to go. So they write a letter of commendation to the Corinthian church, asking them to receive him. So Apollos goes to Corinth, and there he strengthens the Corinthian church immeasurably and helps in discussing with the Jews who had brought a criminal case against Paul before the governor Gallio. He remains in Corinth for some time, engaging in a very effective ministry there. But those converted under his ministry subsequently saw themselves in a secular term as belonging to him when divisions arose after he had left Corinth to return to Ephesus. Now this we learn from 1 Corinthians, the first 4 chapters, where his name is drawn into this rather unhappy discussion where the Corinthians issued an invitation for him to come in preference to Paul to return to work there, even though Paul had spent over a year and a half there working in his own ministry. It's in 1 Corinthians 16 where it says, "Now about our brother Apollo," this is Paul writing, "I strongly urged him to go to you with the brothers. He was quite unwilling to go now, but he will go when he has the opportunity." So here, the phrase "now about our brother" indicates that he was answering a question that the Corinthians had written to him. And given the sophistication of the church in Corinth and their love of Greek oratory, the Apollo lobby, if you will, was able to convince the church that its interests were best served by inviting Apollos to return. And in reading between the lines there, in subsequent days, what may be thought of as Paul's ministry was couched in rhetorical language that indicates that he possessed neither the charismatic presence of Apollos or the physical presence of Apollos. For his bodily presence, quote, was weak, and his rhetorical style didn't exhibit the hallmarks of speech suited to an educated and sophisticated Corinthian audience. Paul, however, for his part, he bore no resentment towards Apollos as he writes back to the Corinthian church. He refuses to be drawn into their secular way of operating. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 where Paul condemns their pitting his people against Apollos' people, and he calls them immature and worldly. It's a mark of his maturity and that of Apollos that neither of them wanted to engage in this kind of back and forth that was so common in worldly teachers. The text in 1 Corinthians 16 indicates that Apollos refused the invitation to return, having judged that it was not the will of God for him to respond immediately to their request, although he might feel it was right to respond at a later stage. To finish up with Apollos, we hear about him one more time, about 10 years later. It's when Paul is writing to Titus after Paul's first release from Roman prison in the early 60s AD. And here, Apollos, whose education would have qualified him as a lawyer, was in transit with Zenas, another lawyer, or probably better, a legal assistant. And Paul commands Titus to ensure that, quote, they have everything they need, probably meaning they have money to get where they need to go. Which indicates that even 10 years later, Apollos was still engaged in a full-time Christian ministry and hence entitled to Christian support by Paul's own theology. You think about it, while Apollos could have secured great wealth and lived quite well with his education and his ability to speak, he chose to use it for the sake of Christ and his kingdom, and in doing so contributes greatly to our understanding of the first century church. Here's one final question for us to consider, and then the lesson will be yours. Well, that finishes our lesson for today. And if you will, read ahead to the next couple of chapters. We're going to look at the third missionary journey next week. May God bless you as you use your gifts and your talents for Him this week. I'll see you next week.